Hi, everyone. How's everyone enjoying the conference so far? Having a good time? It's very early in the morning. I'm sorry. There's a couple things I'm going to make you answer. Bear with me. So this is actually my first time in Germany, which is very exciting. But I'm here to talk to you about how to talk like an engineer. And what I want to say first off is that you've all given me a lot to think about over the last couple of days, because there's something you do that I don't. You all speak two languages. You all understand all of the German conversations and talks that you've had in the last couple of days, and hopefully you understand me. And that means that when you are speaking about technology, you do a translation in your head. So there's a lot that I can learn from that, because that's not a skill I have. But they put me on the stage, so I'm hoping you can learn something from me as well. So I'm going to describe an engineer for you, and I want you to raise your hand if it describes you. But I want you to make sure that everything I say describes you. So this is an engineer who works in a basement or other dark room. They have their headphones on all day long. No one ever approaches them to talk to them. But what's more, they don't talk to anyone at all. Not through email, not through Slack or other messaging services, not even through comments on GitHub. Does this describe any of you? I don't believe you. So I'm guessing the answer is no, and save for a couple of hands, I seem to be right. And the reason this is incorrect is because it's the stereotype. This stereotype is that we as engineers are antisocial, we really like the dark, and we always wear headphones. It's like we're vampires. But the reality is, we know that's not true. And you would think that because we know that amongst ourselves, it's not harmful. Well, it is harmful. It's harmful because we know that stereotypes were created from somewhere. There's a little bit of truth to them. So we start thinking about the fact that somewhere out there in the world of engineers, there are antisocial vampires who live in a basement, and they code just like we do. And if we let ourselves believe this, we get a false sense of security. We start thinking that compared to other engineers, we are great at communication. And then we think about all the things that are hard about our job. We have to learn all the code. We have to figure out the problem domains that we work in. We have to deal with management. And so if communication is a skill that we are above average in because we actually speak to people, then it's not something we need to worry about. Box checked. Except that's not true. We all need to worry about communication because, as our keynote said yesterday, coding is sometimes the easiest part. So why am I on stage telling you that I think I know something about this? Who gave me the authority? Well, no one. I gave it to myself. But this is actually my job. I am a software engineer at Gatsby, which is a JavaScript framework, and I work on the learning team, which means all day, every day, I am teaching people how to use software. And beyond that, I am a public speaker and a blogger and a teacher. So everything I do is talking to people about technology. And based on that, I'm here to tell you that communication is your most critical skill. And that's because communication, specifically poor communication, is a root cause of failure on almost every project. If you sit down and you do your meeting at the end of your project and you look back in your retro and you say, what went wrong? about 95% of the time, it started because of poor communication. Someone didn't understand someone else. They didn't describe something accurately. They wrote something down incorrectly. Either way, two people came away from a conversation with different thoughts as to what they had just discussed. So when we think about communication, there are certain things that we kind of put our big girl business hats on for, and we say, we're communicating right now. We need to do this well. And that tends to be meetings. This is a time where we're cognizant of how we communicate. And then if you think about it a little more, we recognize that when we're training or teaching other people, we need to be very aware of our communication. And then we can go a step farther and realize that when we document things, we can be very aware of our communication. But we tend to discount other things. We communicate in code, for example. As it turns out, we are always communicating something. So what are the consequences to communicating poorly? Why does it matter? Well, first of all, when we communicate poorly, we tend to confuse people. They come away from the conversation not understanding what we want them to do. And you may be sitting here and say, Laurie, okay, why do I care if I confuse somebody? That's not the end of the world. And maybe not, but it tends to lead to frustration. When you confuse people, they get frustrated that they don't understand, because as technologists, we all consider ourselves to be very intelligent, and we hold ourselves to very high standards. So you get frustrated people creating toxic teams, bad cultures, but maybe this is an extreme example. What if the only consequence of poor communication is that you have an engineer who isn't able to level up to understand the next piece of information that will help them in their career because you haven't explained it well? So their growth is stalled. Well, they're going to get real frustrated too. But that's not the only option. Poor communication can result in a whole host of things, like assumptions. Because you don't know when someone makes an assumption. And what's worse is you don't know what assumption they made. So you come away from a conversation, you come back 2 weeks later, share what you've both done in the meantime, and get mad at each other because you didn't do what you talked about doing. Because one of you thought you were doing one thing and one of you thought you were doing another, and no one really understood that that wasn't what happened. But let's say you're working in products or services. You have customers. If you communicate poorly about your product, how to use it, what it's for, you may see a lack of adoption. Frustrated users aren't going to buy your product or service. What's worse, you change something and you've communicated about it poorly. They're going to abandon the product. You're going to lose money you had before, and you're going to have more frustrated users, and probably frustrated management as well. But none of these are the worst consequence of poor communication. That is reserved for building the wrong thing. Because we spend a whole lot of time and money and energy on making sure we build the right thing. We do market research to make sure what we're building is something people will actually use. We spend time doing user testing and usability research to make sure that the way we're building it is approachable for people. We sit down and design requirements so that everybody knows what we're building. And then we have to engineer it. Then we have to write the code. And we all know that things pop up when we start writing code. Edge cases that we didn't realize, risks, trade-offs. And if we as engineers communicate poorly about these things, then we end up building the wrong thing. That root cause. Everything else we did doesn't matter. Vocabulary is a huge component to learning any new language, and programming languages are no exception. This is a quote by Joel Hooks, who's co-founder of Egghead, which is a video learning platform for developers. He's right, but it's also incomplete. vocabulary is a huge part of learning everything in technology, not just programming languages. It's a huge part of learning third-party libraries, services, products, other new technology. And as it turns out, this is where communication in engineering is really quite challenging. Because communication is always hard as humans. We have cultural clashes, we have emotions, we have bad days. But if you take all of that away, if you had two robots with none of those human emotions involved in their communication, they would still go astray when talking about technology. And that's because of vocabulary. The reality is, tech is breadth and depth. And what do I mean by that? Well, everyone here in this room is an expert in something. You have a depth of knowledge in one area. Ideally, you know all the terms and vocabularies for your job. But if you are a back-end engineer, there are front-end engineering experts. There are security experts, hardware experts, infrastructure experts, PM experts, business experts, all of whom probably exist within your company. And they have a whole host of vocabulary that you've never heard of. So there are a lot of terms to know. Because I work in JavaScript land most of the days. So I have to know CSS and Vue and Angular and React and Gatsby and Gridsome and pseudo-classes and cross-site scripting and browser compatibility. And how many of those words did you miss? Do you know all of them? Did I know all of them a month ago or a year ago or two? You may think that this is a problem that's exclusive to new coders. And it is a new coder problem, but it's not exclusive to them. And I'd argue that they have it better off than the rest of us, because people assume that they don't know things. They go the extra mile in explaining things. They make sure that they're on the same page as the new engineer that they're talking to. It's also true for people who are new to the technology. They may be an expert in hardware, but they might not be an expert in databases, or new to the team. Their company used different terminology than yours, even though their tech stack was the same. And all of these are true. But I would argue that this is most often a senior problem. This is a problem that experts encounter. And that's for two reasons. The first is, when you are an expert at your company, they don't have reason to hire 6 other experts just like you. Why would they? They have you. But they do have reason to hire an expert in the areas you don't know. And very often you're asked to come to the table and sit and have a conversation with 6 other experts, all of whom have an impressive depth of vocabulary in their area of specialty. And you're meant to interface and have a conversation with them. And most of the time, no one's assuming that you don't know things. You're an expert. You just have to figure it out. The other reason this comes up a lot for seniors is that you are the smartest and most capable person on the team in your area of expertise, which means they're going to give you all the problems that no one else has yet solved. And a lot of the time, that means that you need to pull in a new tool or look at new documentation that no one else understands. Where's your expert to ask questions to? Well, they don't exist. So you find yourself, as you move along in your career, encountering more and more vocabulary and having less time to pick it up. I love this cartoon. You could replace React with anything. But the idea is that a junior developer is going to get one step and hit themselves in the face. They're going to run into vocabulary they don't know very early on. And they're going to do it again and again and again and again. But a senior developer is going to get a little further. They're going to start reading up on a new technology or start a conversation with another expert, and they're not going to get tripped up when someone says Git. And they're not going to get tripped up when someone says cloud. But maybe they'll get tripped up on EC2, or maybe they'll get tripped up on any number of other pieces of vocabulary. It's going to happen eventually. It's just going to take a little longer. So how do you solve the problem of words you don't know? I'm sitting here telling you have to figure it out, and you have to make it easy for everyone else on your team to figure out, but how do you do it? Well, as it turns out, no matter what size of team you have or what problem domain you work in, there's a few categories that vocabulary always falls under. And there are certain tips and tricks we can use to mitigate these problems. The first is acronyms. And you're all sitting here rolling your eyes and saying, we know we're not supposed to use acronyms, Laurie. Okay, then stop doing it. But we use acronyms, and then we use acronyms inside acronyms. And then we use numericryms. Did you know that was a thing? A11Y means accessibility because there's 11 letters between A and Y. I18N, 18 letters between I and N in internationalization. Why do we do this? We don't know. But we do. And a friend of mine tells this great story of a really large company that had two teams that had never worked together before. And there was this huge conference call to kick off this new project where they'd be collaborating for the first time. 100 people on this conference call. And about 5 minutes into the call, 2 PMs on either team, program managers, see, acronyms. 2 PMs on either team started having an argument as to whether ABC technology could actually support the use case they were discussing. 10 minutes of arguing with 100 people on this call. Finally, someone steps in and asks them each to define ABC. Different systems. Same acronym, different systems. So 2 things when it comes to acronyms. The rule is to define it first. We tend to be okay with this when we write it. We're really bad at this when we speak, because we assume that everyone knows CS stands for computer science. But you had to learn it once first, so stop assuming. Another thing we see a lot in technology is overloaded terms, things like agile that no longer mean what we say they mean. You have to use overloaded terms sometimes in technology. But what you also have to do is make sure that you give proper context to when you are using them. Wireframes mean something different to a UI designer versus a front-end engineer, and still something different to a back-end engineer. Make sure that when you use a term like that, people understand what your definition of it is. Now we come to my favorite type of vocabulary that people struggle with. So I think this is a thing in Germany, but I do apologize. When you are in the United States and you need to blow your nose, which someone just did, well-timed, sir. You need to blow your nose, and someone asks if you want a Kleenex. They mean, do you want a tissue? But a Kleenex is a very popular brand name, so people switch that word. But that means that if you know what a tissue is and you don't know what a Kleenex is, you are now confused. We do this all the time. We say Docker when we mean container. We say AWS when we mean the cloud. MongoDB when we mean NoSQL. Git when we mean version control of any kind. GitHub when we mean Git. MySQL when we mean SQL. We do this constantly, and we fail people when we do. Because it's really important that we don't use the technology, and we use the concept. And it's especially important when you're the expert around the table with a bunch of other experts. Because I don't know about you, but when you work in various areas of technology over time, you start seeing parallels and patterns. And you can't see those parallel concepts if people use a specific tool term when they're really just talking about the concept. The other thing that we like to do is unintuitive product names. What in the world is MongoDB? Or AWS. That one's a little better, but it's an acronym, so we already dealt with that. GitHub, like, none of these make sense. And the reality is that marketing teams have taken over naming things to help with adoption. We're probably not going to be able to change that anytime soon. But we recognize that naming things is important. We argue about naming variables, functions, file names. So why all of a sudden do we abandon the usefulness of naming when we name a product? I know why. Naming things is fun. We can call it Star Wars ship if we want to. The reality is that if you're in charge of naming an internal tool, I beg of you not to do this. Name it appropriately. Give it an explicit and descriptive name that tells people what it is. And I'm working on this on the other side, but if you work for a product or service that has an unintuitive name, because they all do, your job is to hound your marketing team. Make sure that the very first thing on their website is a description of what it does, not how it can interrupt industries the world around. So now we get to the final piece of the puzzle, the root problem, new core concepts. Because these are going to come up. If you work in databases, you may not understand cross-site scripting on the browser side, or you may. If you work in hardware, you may not understand what someone says when they say pseudo classes in CSS. This is hard. There are going to be things that you just don't know. So there's things we can do about this. No intentionally obtuse language. What does that mean? Well, it means that we as an industry like to gatekeep because it makes us feel smart. Have you ever been in a conversation and all of a sudden felt kind of puffed up in your chest and fancy because you used a bunch of words you didn't know 2 weeks ago? Yeah, that's a sign you're being a jerk. Don't do that. Unless you're talking to someone who taught you those terms in the first place, then you're probably okay. We like to do this because it makes us feel smart. But it's smarter to make sure we're understood. Qualifiers matter. Just, easy, simple, obvious. When we're teaching people and explaining things and talking about technology concepts, we like to add these in. And it causes a fair amount of problems. Because one of two things is going to happen. Either it is simple, obvious, and easy for the person who's learning it, in which case you've just invalidated their win and their ability to understand this concept. Or it's not simple. And they're about to get really frustrated because clearly they're stupid for not understanding this thing that you all said would be so easy. What you actually mean when you say things like this is you are capable. You can understand this. Talk to your subject. Don't make sweeping observations about the thing that you're talking about because everyone learns and comprehends differently. Environment is key. Now, we all know that we can ask questions. But what if I told you that most of the time that someone gets up the courage to ask a question in a meeting or a training, 3 other people had the same question but were afraid to ask it? In your meetings, in your company as a whole, do people feel comfortable asking for clarification? If people add an explanation, does everyone in the room feel condescended to? These are signs of a culture that's not doing well. The assumption should be that everyone explains up front so that no one has to ask a question. And that anyone who asks a question is doing it for the betterment of the room, the team, and the company as a whole. If we don't do that, then we start making assumptions. And we all know how well that goes. The reality is, everyone in this room is an expert. I've said that. I've validated you. There's a lot that you know, and you're learning more from being here. But that also means you are the solution to this problem. It is your job to make your communication understandable. And that means you don't get to stand in a conversation with a puffed up chest and say, I feel super smart with all these fancy words I'm using. You want to because it feels good. But do you know what feels better? Someone coming up to you and saying, thank you, you taught me so much. Or seeing that junior engineer that you're working with level up. Or creating a culture where you never have to worry about going to a high-level meeting and being lost for 30 minutes. Look outside your point of view. Try not to take for granted everything you now know. We tend to do this a lot. As soon as we learn something, we assume that everyone else already knew it. It's that imposter syndrome. But if you can take a step back and look at your area of expertise and recognize all the things that you had to learn along the way, all the things that other people don't know, all the terms involved in that learning, then you start to recognize some of the areas that you need to be careful. Because you want to be intentional about the language that you use. You want to make sure that you're only using vocabulary when you absolutely have to. And that when you use terms that people are less likely to know, like specific technologies or acronyms, that you define them and you explain them. You'll find that a lot of self-taught engineers over the years are really great at understanding concepts, but they don't always know the keywords. And when we learn ad hoc as we move forward in our career, we learn concepts, and we don't always use keywords. This is why this is a senior problem. Anticipate challenges. It is our job to know edge cases. It is our job to sit down and fix the bug. So why is it that this doesn't apply in communication? Look for your edge cases. Look for your challenges. Find your bugs and root them out. Make sure that everyone on your team and everyone in the conversation is on the same page. And recognize your responsibility, because this is your responsibility. It is not the responsibility of the person standing in front of you trying to understand what you say to ask you to clarify everything, because that's intimidating to do. You know this. You're the expert. You sit in the room with other experts, and you don't want someone to call into question whether you know what you're doing, so you don't ask for clarification and you try and figure it out. Everyone on your team is the same way. We're prideful as engineers. We want to feel smart. We hold ourselves to high standards. So recognize that the responsibility of strong communication is on the communicator. Because the reality is that you are only an expert if you can make everyone else in the room understand complex topics. You are not an expert because you know how to use a tool really, really well. You are not an expert because you stand on stage and give conference talks. You are an expert because you make complexity understandable. Technology is breadth and depth. It's about expanding on your depth, making it approachable for everyone else, and being able to understand the breadth around you. Then, and only then, will you really talk like an engineer. Thank you.